Okay, so welcome back, Bio 11, to the penultimate class. Tomorrow we're going to be covering the reproductive system and the urinary system, and that'll be it as far as labs. All right, so we just have today and tomorrow. Um, this lab today is about the cardiovascular system, which is supposed to be included in your lab book. However, uh, due to an error made by the publisher when we ordered the Queen's College edition. For whatever reason, they forgot to include it. All right, so you guys are lucky. I hopefully you all received the PDF of this cardiovascular system chapter. Only 5 pages long. Cut it short. All right, I think you have more than enough with those 5 pages. All right, so we'll get started. All right, we'll start off with what is a blood vessel, right? Blood vessel, right? Mammals, as all vertebrates and chordates, have a closed circulatory system. It means the blood doesn't leave the blood vessels. So there has to be a way for the blood to be able to circulate away from the heart and then back to the heart without leaving a blood vessel. And the way they do that is through a system of different sized blood vessels. So let's start with the veins. These are the large blood vessels that take blood away from organs, tissue systems, and towards the heart. Now, they connect to these organs and tissue systems through smaller blood vessels, the venules, and even further via the capillaries. So the capillaries are the thin blood vessels that are so thin that the blood cells only pass in single file through them, and they're the ones that are in direct contact with all the tissues. Those capillaries, the walls of the capillaries, are thin enough for diffusion to be able to occur, right? Diffusion of sugars from the products of digestion. Um, and other good stuff that we get after eating food. The products of metabolic waste, what the waste that the cells produce, has to get back into the bloodstream through those capillaries. Oxygen and carbon dioxide pass freely through those thin capillary walls. All right, so these capillaries are the ones that will connect to the venules, and the venules will connect to the veins. The blood will enter the heart, and then the heart will take the blood out through arteries. And then the arteries will become arterioles, and then the arterioles will connect to the capillaries again. So it's at the point of the capillaries that the blood goes from a vein into an artery, for example. So as the blood passes by some tissue system that requires oxygen or nutrition, or has to dump out some carbon dioxide or metabolic waste, other metabolic waste, then it's passing through the capillaries, and as it goes from one end of the capillary to the next, it's exchanged. That blood cell is being exchanged from a vein to an artery, or vice versa. Okay. All right. So just to orient us, yesterday we were pretending to cut our pig, right? And we discovered the heart. All right. So here we have the heart, and you see that it's in these mesenteries. This is the mesentery. This is what I was talking about. It's thin tissue. And this particular mesentery we call the pericardium. Right? The pericardium is just the membrane, the mesenteric membrane, very similar to the mesenteries in the thoracic cavity anyway. They're not going to call it mesenteries. They're going to call it the pericardium, specifically because it's in the thoracic region. Uh, But the mesenteries that I told you about yesterday that hold the abdominal organs in place are very much the same. All right, so the pericardial sac, or the pericardium, is exactly that, a sac that holds the heart in place. And it's filled with fluid, and it keeps the heart from being bounced around by the movement of the body. All right, so it's like a cushion. All right, so just as a review, this is the thoracic cavity, and here are the lungs. Okay, here and here. And then you have the diaphragm lying on top of, this is the liver. Right? This is the spleen. I apologize, that is not the spleen. It looked a little bit like the spleen because of the pink color. That's the stomach. Okay. All right, so that was the stomach, and the spleen would be around here somewhere. Somewhere around here. Okay. Now, we took a look at the heart, and what you would find if you were to take a look at the heart in real life, in the lab, you would find a series of blood vessels and 4 chambers. Okay, so 4 portions. The 4 chambers are the right atrium, the left atrium, the right ventricle, and the left ventricle. So let's talk about the right atrium. Okay, so what is that? All right, so the right atrium, both atriums are receiving chambers. The right atrium is the receiving chamber from the systemic circuit. In other words, it's the receiving chamber that takes blood from the body. The main blood vessel that brings blood to the right atrium is the vena cava. Vena cava or vena cava. And the vena cava is split into 2. So you have an inferior vena cava, which is the one down here, okay, and you have a superior vena cava. There are other terms. Instead of superior, you can call it the anterior because it's closer to the mouth. And instead of inferior, you can call it the posterior because it's closer to the backside. All right, so you have the right atrium, which takes in oxygen, poor blood. This is the blood that's returning to the heart after it's passed on its oxygen, and it's ready now to make its way into the lungs. So this blood is oxygen poor but carbon dioxide rich. All right. So here are the 4 chambers again. Here is, I like to call these the Mickey Mouse ears of the heart, although they're a little bit floppy. Okay, so they lie over the other 2 ventricles because you have the right atrium and the left atrium. So it's the pig's right, not your right, not to the right of the image, but to the right of the pig. And the left, same thing, left of the pig, not the left of the image. Okay. All right, so the blood, here's the vena cava. Let me change the color. Here's the superior vena cava, and the inferior vena cava is passing around here somewhere. You can't really see it in this picture. And they both meet at the right atrium and dump blood in there. Then the blood will pass through into the right ventricle, and the right ventricle will take that blood and push it out the pulmonary artery. All right, this is pulmonary artery will take blood to the lungs, and the blood will return via pulmonary veins to this chamber, the left atrium. The left atrium will push blood into the left ventricle, The left ventricle will then, and I'm going to change the color, push blood out into the aorta, to the aortic arch. Okay. Okay. So the aortic arch splits, and you're able to take blood up to the head and neck regions and to the front limb regions, and it'll arch down. That's why it's called an arch, and it will pass down the body in the aorta. Okay. So I'm going to tell you this story again and again and again today, and hopefully through repetition, you guys will be able to pick it up real fast. All right. Okay. So let's go through the chambers of the heart. Right. We started with the right atrium. Now we're going into the right ventricle. Okay. So here we have blood enters through the vena cava, superior or inferior, or anterior, posterior. And it enters the right atrium. And before it enters the right ventricle, which is here, this little chamber here, it must pass through a valve. The valves are there because the valves will prevent the blood from backing up. It'll prevent the blood from going in the wrong direction. So as blood passes through, the valve opens and then it closes, so the blood can't go backwards. All right, so that valve, we call it the tricuspid valve. And from there, the right ventricle, which is a smaller ventricle, will pump blood into the pulmonary trunk. Okay, so this is the pulmonary trunk, where it also passes through a valve. All right, that's the semilunar valve, the pulmonary semilunar valve. So the pulmonary semilunar valve, which is right here, actually let me color it a different color. Right here, the white's right here. Pulmonary semilunar valve will again do the same, perform the same function, the prevention of blood from flowing backwards. So the blood enters the right atrium, into the right ventricle, and into the pulmonary trunk, which splits into the pulmonary arteries. And the pulmonary arteries will take blood to each of the lobes of the lungs. All right, so remember you have your right lung and your left lung. Then, when the blood is coming back from the lungs, it's exchanged its carbon dioxide for oxygen. So now it's returning oxygen rich. And it's returning via the pulmonary arteries, right, on each side. The pulmonary arteries connect here at the left atrium. So the left atrium is the receiving chamber of blood from the lungs. This is from the pulmonary circuit. So you have the pulmonary circuit, which is blood from the heart to the lungs and from the lungs to the heart. And you have the systemic circuit from the heart to the body and from the body to the heart. All right. So we have the blood entering the left atrium from these pulmonary veins. And before it enters the left ventricle, it must pass through this valve, all right, which we call the bicuspid valve. You can also call it the mitral valve or mitral valve. All right, but I prefer bicuspid because it sounds a lot like the tricuspid. All right, so one way that you can keep track of which one comes first is just remember reverse alphabetical order. Tri, which is T, comes first because it's backwards alphabetical order, and bi after that. And since the two words sound similar, then it's easier to remember both of them. All right, so far, blood has traveled quite a bit, right? It's entered the right atrium, gone through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, out the semilunar pulmonary valve, into the pulmonary trunk, into the pulmonary arteries, to the lungs, back. Ooh, okay, so I see a mistake here. It should be veins. Veins. Okay. So the blood goes to the lungs from the pulmonary arteries and comes back via the pulmonary veins, right? Here it says pulmonary veins. So this little diagram has a mistake. All right, and the pulmonary veins will bring blood to the the left atrium, and the blood will then go through the bicuspid valve, and it'll enter the left ventricle. Okay, so here you have the left ventricle being highlighted. Okay. And remember, there is some thick heart muscle that separates the ventricles, and that's called the septum. Okay, and that's this stuff here. So the blood enters the left ventricle, and now it gets pumped out of the blood, out of the heart, and it gets pumped into the aorta. Now, not pictured here is the aortic semilunar valve, which is a valve that looks like the pulmonary valve, but it's at the base of the aorta. Okay, so it does the same function. It prevents blood from backing up. Okay, so from the aorta, the blood will travel throughout the blood vessels that will take it to the body. So that's the systemic circuit. Okay, so here it is again. You guys can use this to go over it again. From the body, right? The blood from the body enters. Here's the superior, or also known as anterior vena cava, and here's the inferior, and it enters the right atrium. Passes through the tricuspid valve, and then it must get to the lungs. So it has to pass through this semilunar pulmonary valve into the pulmonary trunk, which is this, and that splits into the pulmonary arteries. Then the blood returns from the lung into the pulmonary veins. Okay. Into the left atrium, passes through the bicuspid valve. All right, this is, by the way, this is the stronger through the bicuspid valve into the ventricle, left ventricle, which is, by the way, the stronger, more muscular side of the ventricles. Now, why is that important? Why would it be more a little bit stronger, have a thicker muscle to pump the blood out? because this is the blood that has to travel throughout the rest of the body. So it has to be strong enough to push the blood to the entire body. All right, so the blood will enter the left ventricle and pass into the aorta, but before it does that, it must pass through the aortic valve. So you can see it here. All right, so the blood will enter the aorta, the aortic arch. It's an arch. All right, and this is the descending aorta, or the dorsal aorta, and there are some splits that occur up here as well. All right. Here are some views of that again. You guys can use these to go over that, right? So the superior vena cava, here's an external view of the heart. Superior vena cava, here's the right atrium, right ventricle, and then the pulmonary arteries. Blood comes back through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, to the aorta. Okay, we did this already. So if you guys are able to memorize this order of sequences, then you should be able to, in other words, that means you've learned what you were supposed to learn for the heart. Know your chambers, know your blood vessels, know your valves, and which way the blood travels. Okay. So, that pulmonary circuit, nothing I haven't said before. The blood is carried from the heart to the lungs, and then from the lungs back to the heart. That's the pulmonary circuit. And that involves a couple of blood vessels, which I've already mentioned. First, you have the pulmonary trunk, which splits into the pulmonary arteries. Okay, so it goes this way. And the blood comes back from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. So remember, veins always take blood to the heart, and arteries always take blood away from the heart. Right, so the blood is coming back from the lungs through the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, which then goes into the left ventricle, and then out the aorta. Okay, so this is the dorsal aorta. All right. This is more of the same. All right, so what does it look like in real life? Here's a picture of that. And if you guys explored that website that I linked to yesterday, maybe you would have come across this already. All right, so the systemic circuit, right? The blood is being taken from the heart to the body, and then from the body to the heart. All right, so this blood that goes out of the heart has to be oxygen rich because it's already gone through the pulmonary circuit. And therefore, carbon dioxide poor. It'll increase in carbon dioxide as it passes through the capillaries that take it to the tissue layers, to the organ systems, and it'll, of course, therefore lose oxygen. All right, and remember the heart returns to the blood returns to the heart via the veins, right? And all the veins will eventually conglomerate into either the inferior or the superior vena cava. Okay, so here are the arteries. When the when this chamber of the heart pumps blood out, it'll pump it out into a blood vessel that's behind here. So here, it's this one here. Okay. So here it is, the aortic arch. It's behind this pulmonary artery. The aortic arch will split, and either it'll split into the right subclavian artery or the left subclavian artery. What is a subclavian? Subclavian arteries are the arteries that are found underneath the clavicle, subclavian. Their primary purpose is to bring oxygen-rich blood from the heart to the shoulders and the arms, so the front limbs of this pig. Another split that will happen is the carotid split. It'll have a left common carotid and a right common carotid. These are the blood vessels that you can feel on your neck pumping. They pump because they're so close to the heart that you still feel the pumping motion of the heart. Right? They are very strong pumping sensations. So you can put 2 fingers on your neck and you can feel that. All right, so you have the carotid artery, left and right. Left and right. So for anything superior, above, or anterior to the heart, in terms of arteries, just remember right subclavian artery, left subclavian artery, and the carotids. Okay? You have the subclavian arteries and the carotid arteries. At the level of the heart, you have the aortic arch and the dorsal aorta. We call it the dorsal aorta because it runs dorsally, right? This right around here is your backbone, or the backbone of this pig. So that's where your aorta runs also. Okay, what is this? Ductus arteriosus. I'm not going to hold you to this, though, but I would like to talk about it. All right, the ductus arteriosus is a bypass that exists in the fetal pig or fetus in general, fetuses in general. It's a bypass that will connect the pulmonary circuit to the aorta. The aorta, connects directly to the umbilical cord, right? So remember, the lungs of the fetal pig are not providing oxygen to the fetus. The lungs of a fetus are not providing oxygen to the fetus because the fetus is surrounded by amniotic fluid. So there's a bypass because we don't need to take blood to the lungs there, other than to feed the tissue of the lungs to keep the cells alive. But they're not going there to collect oxygen. So instead, the fetal pig will be receiving oxygen from the blood that it receives from the mom through the umbilical cord, through the placenta, and then the umbilical cord. But don't worry about that. I just wanted to, in case you have questions about the ductus arteriosus. Okay. Then, as far as the systemic circuit, the blood returns through the vena cava, which is not pictured here. Let's see if the next picture shows it. No, so we're going to keep going with this. So again, here's another view. Here's another view. Here's the pulmonary artery, which takes blood to the hearts. Okay, and in this case, it's been bypassed a little bit. But all right, here is that pulmonary trunk or pulmonary arteries. Then you have the aortic arch. Not that visible here, but it's just above this, from here to here. Okay, and it goes this way. And it splits. Okay. So this location where it splits is the brachiocephalic artery. You have the right subclavian, the left subclavian, and then the carotid. Okay. Here's the larynx, and here's the trachea. Remember the trachea, the cartilaginous rings? All right. What about the how does the blood get back to the heart? Well, you have, like I said before, the vena cava. Vena cavae for plural. Right, from the top of the body of the pig, you have the interior vena cava, and from the bottom you have the posterior vena cava. Very thick blue blood vessels, and they both enter the right atrium of the heart. Right, the heart is right here. This, by the way, is the liver, and this is the diaphragm. And here you have the lungs. Okay. So here's a view of what happens to those. Where does what blood vessels lead to the vena cava? Okay, so you have, in fact, the opposite of the carotids, which, by the way, are, I'm going to paint those in red. Here's one carotid, and here's the other. Okay, so those carotid arteries are there, and they're the ones taking blood to the head. And what drains the head? Well, the jugular veins do. So you do need to know the jugular veins, right? You have 1 and 2. The one closest to the trachea is the internal, and the one further away is the external. And there are 2 more over here. Right, so you have right and left jugulars. And you have subclavians. Okay? So remember, blood is traveling in this direction. And it goes into the anterior vena cava. Here's another view. You see the anterior vena cava. Very similar. And it just shows the subclavian veins a little bit better. It passes through here. Okay. Okay. So the vena cava will pass the inferior vena cava or posterior vena cava will pass through the liver, right? And you'll see it here, and maybe here, and here it is again. Okay, posterior vena cava. The posterior vena cava, as far as the veins that split from the posterior vena cava or join better term is join the posterior vena cava. In the abdominal cavity, really you should know the renal vein. Here, I didn't discuss the kidneys yesterday. Here they are. Here's one kidney, and there's a renal vein. Okay, so the blood is going this way, and it travels that way, right? There are, of course, many, many veins that connect to the intestines and the stomach and the liver, etc. But I'm not going to hold you to those, all right? The one I do want you to know is the one that connects to the kidneys as a renal vein. All right, and keep in mind the renal artery, which is the artery that takes blood to the kidneys. And that's because the aorta is right here. Here's the aorta. And it'll connect. So that's the dorsal aorta. Okay. Here are the kidneys again. 1, remember we have paired kidneys. 2, there's the posterior vena cava, and it's splitting, right? Well, not splitting, but joining. Here's the renal vein joining the posterior vena cava. You have some iliac veins, but don't worry about those. All right. And you have the aorta. I'm going to color it in red here. And it's splitting here, right? And here you have the umbilical arteries, right? That surrounds the urinary bladder. I'll talk about that tomorrow. All right, and you have some iliacs as well. Okay, iliac arteries. But you have the arteries from the aorta that split and go into the kidneys, and those are the renal arteries. Okay, so here's a diagram of what was just discussed. Basically, you have the pulmonary circuit, so that's blood from the heart to the lungs, and at the capillary level is where the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange happens, and then from the lungs back to the heart. And the systemic circuit, from the heart to the body through the aorta, and again they deliver oxygen to the body tissues through the capillaries, and when they're coming back from the capillaries, it goes in through either the superior or inferior vena cava. Okay, so here's like a flow chart of how the blood travels, right? From the capillaries, let's say it's going from the capillaries to the veins, from the capillaries to the venules, to the veins, which join up and become the vena cava, and the blood then enters the right atrium, goes through the tricuspid valve, enters the right ventricle, goes through the pulmonary semilunar valve, enter the pulmonary arteries, and then it goes into the lungs. At this point, it's all CO2 rich and O2 poor. Then it exchanges that carbon dioxide for oxygen, and it leaves the lungs by entering the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, into, let's call it the bicuspid, through the bicuspid valve, into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will pump it out to the aorta via the aortic semilunar valve into the aorta. The aorta splits into the arteries and the arterioles, and then finally into the capillaries. And back again. Okay? All right, at this point, let's go into the chapter. Okay. All right. I have a pretty bad scanner, and so the quality of the image is not the best. I apologize for that, but we'll make it do. We'll make do with what we have. All right, so the first question is, which ventricle is more muscular? So that would be the, let me write, gotta dip this thing in ink, right? Left ventricle. Okay, the left ventricle. Why is this appropriate? And I told you why, right? It has to do with taking blood out of where does the ventricle pump blood to? So look that up. And then let's see here. Pulmonary veins return blood from the lungs to the left atrium. Why are the pulmonary veins colored red in figure 20.2? The pulmonary veins, here we go. And that's because they are what? They are oxygen rich, coming from the lungs. Okay. All right, to demonstrate that oxygen-poor blood is kept separate from oxygen-rich blood, trace the path of blood from the right side of the heart to the aorta by filling in the blanks with the names of the blood vessels and valves. In the adult mammal, note that blood passes through the lungs to go from the right side of the heart to the left. So from the vena cava into the right atrium, it has to pass through a valve, which is the tricuspid. Remember, reverse alphabetical order. Cuspid. No S there. Cuspid valve. Into the right ventricle. And the right ventricle will pump blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into let's see, we'll call it the pulmonary trunk. This is the vein, this is the artery before it splits. This is the part of the artery that before it splits into the pulmonary arteries. I hope you guys can be a little bit neater than I am. All right, and it goes to the lungs. And then from the lungs, it comes back through the pulmonary veins. Remember, veins take blood to the heart. And enters the the left atrium. And in order for it to leave the left atrium into the left ventricle, it must pass through bicuspid valve. The left ventricle will then pump it into the aorta through the aortic semilunar. So you just have to remember to enter a blood vessel, it's called the semilunar valve, and it's either the aortic or the pulmonary. So you just got to keep in mind which blood vessel it's entering. And if it's entering a valve, sorry, a chamber of the heart, then it would be either the tricuspid or the bicuspid. Is it the first one, which is the tricuspid, from the right atrium to the right ventricle, or is it the second one, from the left atrium to the left ventricle, which would be the bicuspid? Okay, sequence the blood vessels in the pulmonary circuit to trace the path of blood from the right ventricle to the left atrium of the heart. From the right ventricle to the left atrium. Right ventricle of the heart into the the pulmonary. Again, it's the same thing. Pulmonary trunk, because nothing makes you learn like repetition. Pulmonary trunk to pulmonary arteries. All right, arteries take blood away from the heart to the lungs, and then from the lungs to the pulmonary veins. Veins bringing blood to the heart, into the left atrium. Which of these blood vessels contains oxygen-rich blood? Pulmonary veins. Usually veins, like I said before, usually veins are the oxygen-poor blood vessels, but in this case, it's reversed in the pulmonary circuit. So in this case, the pulmonary veins are oxygen-rich. The major blood vessels in the systemic system are the aorta and the vena cava. Otherwise, all right, with the help of figure 20.3, complete the table. Here we go. What major artery feeds the head? And that would be the carotid. And what drains the head? It would be the jugulars. What major artery feeds the front legs, or in other words, the arms? And that would be the subclavian. Subclavian artery and the subclavian veins are the opposite. Subclavian. Okay. And what about the kidneys? I told you, renal artery, and this is easy, renal vein. Hind limbs, I told you not to worry about it, but you can fill it in anyway. Iliac and iliac. The only ones that have different names are the ones for the head. All right, so here's a nice diagram showing everything again. Blood entering the right atrium from the vena cava, right atrium into the right ventricle, to the pulmonary trunk, to the pulmonary arteries, into the lungs, across the capillaries, out of the lungs, into the pulmonary veins, into the left ventricle, into the left atrium, into the left ventricle, pumping out to the aorta. All right, and the aorta become the dorsal aorta or the brachiocephalic vein artery, which splits up into the carotids, the subclavians, etc. Okay. All right, with the help of this table and figure, sequence of blood vessels in the systemic circuit to trace the path of blood from the heart to the kidneys. Left ventricle of the heart to the aorta, to the renal artery. From the kidneys, the blood leaves through the renal veins, and then the renal veins join um, the you can say posterior or inferior. Call it inferior vena cava. Okay, that's it. All right, guys, that's it for today. There are no questions into this chapter. We'll have questions about the circulatory system tomorrow in which is the review section of tomorrow's lab. Okay, have a good day, guys.